This video will focus on dial calipers. The big concept of this lesson is that you will learn what a dial caliper is and how to read measurements from it. So what is a dial caliper? A dial caliper is a precise measurement tool. Like a ruler, a dial caliper has a measurement bar. The measurement bar contains hatch marks that you read similarly to those on a ruler. Unlike a ruler, a dial caliper also contains a dial. The dial allows you to make more precise measurements in smaller increments. So what are the parts of a dial caliper? Well, a dial caliper looks like this. The first part that we're going to take a look at is the inside or internal measuring jaws, located right here. Moving clockwise, we then have the dial, right here. The clamp lock screw, which prevents the slider, this mechanism here, from moving up or down the bar. We then have the beam or bar, which is indicated right here. We then have the depth measuring blade or rod, which allows us to measure inside of internal spaces. We then have the fine adjustment screw, located right here, which allows us to move the dial as well as our measuring areas in fine, small increments. The dial adjustment screw is located on the bottom of the dial and allows us to turn our dial or zero it. We then have the outside or external measuring jaws, which are probably the most frequently used portion of a dial caliper. And then lastly, the reference edge, right here, which is where we take all of our final measurements from. So how do you use a dial caliper? First, you have to zero the dial. Before using it, the dial caliper needs to be set up by checking the dial's zero location. If it needs to be adjusted, you'll use the dial adjustment screw just below the dial. Second, we need to read the measurement. You'll use the numbers provided by the dial caliper to read the measurement taken. So how do I read a dial caliper? First, you identify the whole number on the measurement bar using the scale's reference edge. Similar to the fractions you used on the ruler, you'll use the remaining hatch marks, if any, that show before the reference edge to determine the tenths place value. You'll then use the dial caliper to determine the hundredths and thousandths place digits for your measurement. As already mentioned, we begin by zeroing the dial caliper using the adjustment screw located below the dial. We then use the jaws of the dial caliper to complete our measurement. We read our measurement from the reference edge and the dial. We then add those numbers together to create our final measurement. So let's practice reading a dial caliper. Here's example 1. Look at the dial caliper reading to the right. What measurement is shown? If you need more time to read this dial caliper, pause the video now. If you said 0.007 inches, you are correct. Let's look at another example. Here's example 2. Look at the dial caliper reading to the right. What measurement is shown? If you said 4.044 inches, you are correct. Let's take a look at a third example. Look at the dial caliper reading to the right. What measurement is shown? If you said 1.300 inches, you are correct. Just some real quick clarification. You need to read a dial caliper very carefully. It's important that you look at the dial closely to identify whether you should use the last number you see on the bar. For example, the dial caliper in figure 3 measures an object 5.491 inches long. The dial shows 9.1 and you can see a 5 peeking out from behind the slider on the bar. Because the dial hasn't reached the 0 yet, use the 4 as your tenths value and not the peeking 5 on the measurement bar. So what can a dial caliper measure? Dial calipers can be used in various ways to measure height, width, and depth. Let's take a closer look at that. Here we see an example of how a dial caliper can measure the width of an object. This dial caliper measures the width of this coffee cup to 3.701 inches. Here we see how we can measure the interior width of the coffee cup. This is slightly different than the exterior width, as we can see, since the overall measurement is 3.347 inches. Here we see an example of how a dial caliper can measure the depth of an interior area. The depth of this coffee mug is 3.911 inches. We can also use a caliper to measure a step offset. That means if we have an area that's a different height than another surface area, we can use the caliper to measure that. In this case, we have a step offset of 1.424 inches.